Good evening. Welcome back to the Liminal Record. As always, grab a blanket, grab some popcorn, and let's get into tonight's stories. He was making human traps. I grew up in the countryside, right next to a national park frequently visited by nature lovers and bird enthusiasts. It was the kind of park where you're not really allowed to bike or ride horses, only walk or run. But 10-year-old me thought it was a stupid rule and did so anyway, because the trails were perfect for it. I knew fully well that I wasn't supposed to do that, and was caught a few times, but nothing much came of it apart from a half-hearted don't do it again. And I did, of course. Until one day something frightening happened that made me stop. My family were horse breeders, and I would often take one of the horses for a ride, usually in the Forbidden Park. This day, very early morning, the first day of summer holiday, it was beautiful outdoors. It was misty and foggy, yet a sky that promised a sunny day ahead. Since it was so early, before 6 o'clock, I knew there wouldn't be anyone on the trail to see me, so I let the horse set off full speed along the trail. I only slowed down on the part of the trail that got steep on one side, leading down to the river, because the thought of one step too close to the edge was too much even for a kid with next to non-existent risk assessment skills. Suddenly the horse came to a halt and refused to take another step. I grew up with horses all my life and knew that usually indicates that you need to investigate. Is there something with the hoofs? Did the horse spot something that spooked it? The hooves were fine, but the horse didn't move an inch. That's when I saw it. Someone had set up a trap, a thin, sharp metal wire across the trail, in perfect neck height for an adult. I stopped and looked around, but I didn't see anyone. The wire was well attached to 2 trees, and impossible for me to remove, so I led the horse around it, and to do so I had to walk up a bit to the wooden area on the side of the trail. That's when I heard the singing. There's a song called Hesh Tomtgeber, and it was that melody, but the lyrics were different and sung in a muffled, singering voice. Today I only remember parts of it, but translated it would have been something like, "Hey, all you runners, come here passing, let the lifeblood pour out." As silently as I could with my heart in my throat, I backed away, got up on the horse, and hurried back the way I came as fast as I could. I knew I had to tell someone about it, but at the same time I wanted to avoid admitting to riding a huge and very forbidden horse on this protected trails. So now I had a problem. The old stories about a mad old man living in the shed in the woods, a shed that was once a cottage for the local hunters, came back to me as I hung on the horse for dear life. I got home and I told my older brother what had happened, and he went back there with me in tow. We found the wire trap, and after a while of searching, we also found a spear-like pole in the ground, right on the spot where you'd land if you came running and jumped over a fallen tree on the trail. That's when we called the police. The area was searched, and several similar traps were found, but no sight of the old man. The following summer, though, there was big news in the local paper about spear-like poles being found right under the water's surface, directly under that little tower you're supposed to dive at from the lake. And black garage bags filled with big rocks were found on a narrow bridge crossing the river, so that if a car had hit it, risk is it would have gone off the road and into the water. The woman on my porch. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, I shared a room with my older brother, who was around 15. We live in a suburban area in New York. Not the greatest area, but not riddled with crime. There are 2 windows in my room, one that overlooks the backyard, and one that connects to the front porch. It came in quite handy for my brothers to sneak out and meet with friends. If you step out of the window, you're on the porch, so anyone on the porch can access this window. I was never bothered by that thought because, quite honestly, it never crossed my mind. My bed was touching this window, while my brother's bed was perpendicular to mine. It was an odd setup, but that's beside the point. Now, this was before we had any type of smartphone or laptop to keep ourselves occupied on the nights when we weren't sleepy, so we'd stay up talking to each other and making up dumb games to pass the time. This event took place during the summer. We stayed up into the late hours of the night, perks of having no school. It was probably around 2 a.m., and eventually we were playing a game where one of us was a goalkeeper and the other was taking a shot, like football soccer terms. We would both say at the same time either left, center, or right. If the goalkeeper guessed the same as the one taking the shot, he would get a point, and if the person taking the shot said a position other than what the goalie said, they got a point. We went for a couple of rounds, and I was beating him, even though at this point it's irrelevant. I don't remember what round we were on, but we did our 3, 2, 1 countdown. My brother, the goalkeeper, said left. I, the shooter, said center. The voice from outside the porch window said left. My brother and I froze. We had the shade down, but my mom had left the porch light on, so that was the only light illuminating the room, the dim porch light coming in from the borders of the shade. At the time, my mother was on the opposite side of the house, my sister the room over, my dad in the basement, and my brother and I crapping our pants practically. We waited for what seemed like an hour, but it was probably only 30 to 45 seconds, and we heard a giggle and a playful knock at the window. "Let's go another round. Come on, boys," the voice said in a cheerful, playful tone. Honestly, I want to say it was a scary voice and sounded menacing, but it didn't. It sounded like a woman, not too old, but not young. It was just normal, like a normal sounding voice. Nothing off about it besides where it was coming from and the time it came. My brother and I were seriously freaked out, and I was about to break down because of how close I was to this woman. The thought that all I had to do was lift the shade and I'd be face to face with this person scared me. And it made me go still and stiff, as if I had just looked into Medusa's eyes. After a while of my brother and I not responding, my brother started slowly moving from his bed to the door as to not make any noise. As my brother was tiptoeing to the door, the sound of nails being run down the window started. It was very slow from top to bottom. At that point, my brother made it to the door. He looked back at me and brought his fingertip to his lips, gesturing me to keep quiet. Once the nails stopped running down my window, I heard her light footsteps make their way off my porch and disappear. I lay there for an eternity, not moving until my brother returned, and I saw my mom move hastily by my door, making her way to the front door. The porch light flipped off, and I was left in darkness with my brother waiting in the doorway for Mom's return. I heard my mom call my dad up the stairs and his groggy, annoyed footsteps coming upstairs. They talked, then came in my brother and I's room, and we relayed what happened. Apparently, my mom had caught sight of the lady turning out of our driveway on foot, behind some tall bushes. Thank God we had a long driveway, otherwise my mom probably would have thought we were crazy. Considering no harm was done besides leaving me terrified of my window, my parents didn't call the police. They just thought it was really weird and stayed up the rest of the night to make sure she didn't return. I'm 17 now, and my brother is in college, so I have the room to myself. My bed still touches the window because I'm too lazy to move the rest of the furniture in my room so I can move my bed. The shade of that window has not been opened since that incident, and probably never will be. Poker face. This happened in Antioch, California. It was around 2 a.m. I was at a friend's house. Safe and warm, sheltered suburbia. We were having a lot to drink, chit-chatting, enjoying ourselves. Of course, when you're having fun, time hits the fast-forward button, and those minutes turn into an hour. I had too much to drink. My friend has a bit of an abrupt bedtime, so I had to dodge out early, still intoxicated. I felt too shameful thinking I'd be asking too much to stay in the house to sleep off the drunkenness. I suppose he was either too rude or too drunk to consider it himself. Whatever. Sometimes a little inconvenience makes you appreciate everything else. I needed about another hour or so to sober up to drive back. As fast as time passed during my stay, it decided to drastically slow down as soon as I stepped out of his house. It was a cul-de-sac area, a concrete jungle with the stem of the street breaking into a fork. Alongside the road, my car was parked, The only streetlight that worked was in the middle of the cul-de-sac circle, about 80 yards away. I stumbled towards my car, produced my keys, felt the metal line up, opened my door, and shifted to the back seat. Because this was a dark, strange, and unfamiliar neighborhood, I took the leftover newspaper and a sweater in my back seat to cover myself up. I was a little scared. I wanted to camouflage myself and not just be some guy awkwardly sitting in his car waiting for time to pass in order to drive home. I couldn't fall asleep. The uncomfortable feeling of a cheap backseat bed enshrouded in darkness didn't make the chance of slumber easier. It felt too ominous. And of course, my mind began to wander. I thought of worst-case scenarios, like how the police would shine their lights on me through the window, or a drunk driver hitting my car. And wait. In the distance, about 100 yards away, I could hear footsteps approaching. The gravel scuffed with each step forward, growing in proximity, but periodically taking stops. I wondered why, until it made sense in my head. Whoever it was probably looking through cars carefully, with the intent to steal one. I couldn't recall how many cars were on the block, but I counted 3 full stops until he was at my window breathing. I froze. There was no more than 1 foot between us. The car encapsulated me as I laid hidden beneath the backseat clutter, forming myself into an object, trying my hardest to be unnoticeable, unmoving, and simply not there. "I see you," said a 40-year-old plus man in perverse baby talk. Imagine when you were playing hide and seek, and one of your friends tricks you to coming out. He said it in that tone of voice, as if baiting me, like he was questioning whether the clutter in the back seat was just clutter, or a person. I didn't want to move or check the window. I remained clutter. Give me an Academy Award. My body reacted by minimizing my breathing so much that I felt paralyzed. I dared not to look. My eyes fixated on the back of my passenger seat. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard that it shook my body with each throb. He circled around the car. My ears didn't fail me. I heard the steps. I felt like I was part of the car. I could feel him touching the trunk as he carefully pressed down on it, as if to test the alarm, as if to test me. I was in the middle of fight or flight. I couldn't do either without elevating danger. I was frozen and hoping to God he was bluffing. He circled the car again. The door handle to my right jiggled. He was pulling it multiple times. "I see you." Same tone, but more agitated and stressed. More convinced that he was trying to make that clutter move, revealing itself to be of his expectations that it was me. My muscles tensed like a cow before slaughter. That had to be metal against glass, like if you took a penny right now and tapped it to your window. A crowbar, a knife, a rock, a gun. My eyes fixated on the seat in front of me, never averting my gaze, like he was. I was covered enough to where I couldn't see beyond the seat in front of me. I know I couldn't see him, but I could feel his eyes resting on top of me. "My name is Poker Face. What's your name?" The voice changed in a lower, demented, and serious tone. My mind forced a visual. It wasn't anything human. I already accepted my death. I was ready to be shot in the head and ready to take a life-changing bullet, multiple knife wounds. Just make the sleep bearable, not excruciating, as you drain me of life. I wouldn't know how to react. My thoughts grew dimmer. I imagined my friend waking up the next morning after a calm night of safe and sound sleep, only to discover my mutilated, defiled, and bloodied body hanging outside my car door. It was then I heard nothing but my own heart. What was this person doing now? Just staring at me in the middle of the night, talking to me, or a messy pile in the backseat? Time froze. Then the footsteps were being swallowed in the distance. Thank God he left. I waited another hour until the sun showed hints of itself. I jumped in my front seat and bolted out of there, wide-eyed and sober. One decision. When I was a teenager, I was goth. Black hair, black clothes, black makeup, even had a pair of combat boots. My friends and I, in typical goth fashion, hung out at a local cemetery. We started going as a joke, but soon discovered we liked the peace that we found there. That all changed one night. My friend called to see if I wanted to hang out, and I did. None of our other friends were available. They were either working or recovering from partying the night before, so we were on our own. My friend picked me up and we drove up to the cemetery. We were hanging out, smoking cigs, and BSing about the latest issue she was having with her boyfriend when we noticed at the top of the hill we were on, about 100 foot away, a bonfire had been lit. You have to understand that this cemetery is about a block off campus of a major university, and it's not uncommon for college students to go there to party. My friend and I sighed, knowing that we would have to get going soon. It was illegal to be in the cemetery after dark, and we knew the police would show up because some jerks had decided they needed a bonfire. We decided to finish our cigs and then take off. Just then, the most horrible stench came wafting down the hill from the direction of the bonfire. My friend gagged and covered her mouth. I groaned and said, "What the hell?" My friend shook her head, saying, "I don't know what they're doing. Let's just leave." We get in the car, and one of us suggested, and I honestly don't remember who, maybe we should go up there and see what they're doing. My stomach turned and a cold shiver went through my body. My friend must have had the same feeling, because at the same time we both said, "No, we should leave." My friend turned the car on, switched on her headlights, put the car in reverse, and looked over her shoulder before starting to back up. I was still looking up the hill. A figure stepped in front of the bonfire. I could only see a silhouette, but I was sure whoever it was watching us. A feeling of terror hit me, and I said, "Go, go, go, go," getting louder and more panicked with each word. My friend looked back up the hill for a second, and just as the figure took a step towards us, she slammed on the gas and peeled out, going in reverse down the hill. She rammed the gear shift into drive, and we were out. We didn't say anything for a while until she said, "What the hell were they burning?" I shook my head. "I don't know." She dropped me off at home and I went to bed. The next morning I woke up and went out to the kitchen. My mom was there, drinking her morning coffee, and I joined her. We talked about her job for a bit when she suddenly comes out with, "Did you hear what happened last night?" I shrug and say no. I had just gotten up. She tells me a woman she worked with was kidnapped from the parking garage. "Oh my God," I said. "Did they find her?" "Yes, but too late," she replied. Whoever took her had assaulted her and ended her. They found her this morning in the cemetery. He had tried to dispose of her body in a bonfire. I froze. My brain was going a mile a minute. The realization was slowly creeping up. That's what that smell was. Needless to say, I never hung out at that cemetery at night ever again. I think back to our decision to leave instead of investigating the fire. That one decision could have changed everything. Dark silhouette in the bonfire? Let's not meet. The Smiling Men. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all of that changed in just a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police station patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was quiet at night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man, dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall, very lanky, and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could make out his face. His eyes were wide open and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but I kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about a half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I'd looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time, staring at him. And then he started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated, tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone. Except he was moving very quickly. I'd like to say at this point that I ran away, or pulled out my pepper spray, or my cell phone, or anything at all. But I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again. About a car length away from me, still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What the fuck do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. What the fuck? Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then after what felt like forever, he turned around, very slowly, and started dance walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go, until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. Night vision. It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, always interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday, and he'd left them at my apartment. One night I was bored, and I decided to go try out the goggles at a wooded hiking area / nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, this seems like a very stupid idea, since I was all by myself and female. But I was young and stupid, and I got myself all excited at the possibility of seeing a deer and any other woodland creatures in their natural nighttime habitats. I was familiar with these woods. My best friend and I had hiked there at night before, and we'd never run into anyone else. Our area is pretty rural and pretty safe, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the little sparsely lit parking area, ignored the sign that said park closes at 10, and entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered down through the canopy of trees. It was pretty dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I'd found a place to sit down. So I lit my way with a little mini mag light on my keychain. A couple of times I thought I heard rustling in the woods a fair distance away, but it was nothing out of the ordinary, and I put it down to animal activity. Hopefully the deer I'd come to see. After I'd hiked a fair distance, I found a fallen log to sit on and put on the goggles. I don't know if you've ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is impressive. They can turn near pitch darkness into bright as day. Everything appears in shades of green, but quite clear and bright. For a while I had a blast looking around from my fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby. A big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. No deer, though. And I started to think that maybe they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me, darkness or no, if I sat right out in the open on a log. So I decided to find a place where I could be a little more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods and finally found a huge tree, perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for my deer. I didn't get to see any. What I did see, though, lit up in the bright night vision green after about 10 minutes of waiting, was this. A man, dressed head to toe in dark-colored clothing, making his way stealthily through the woods. He was coming from the same direction I'd come and was clearly trying to stay hidden, moving from tree to tree and glancing around carefully before moving on again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few minutes to notice that he was carrying something, and when I saw what it was, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. He had a knife, a big one, and he was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. It wasn't deer hunting season. This wasn't a nature preserve where hunting of any kind was prohibited. And at any rate, the guy was alone and not dressed like a hunter. There were no deer in sight, and very few hunters kill prey with knives. I was suddenly horribly aware of my situation. A young woman, alone, weaponless, in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 90s, so no cell phones, and even if I'd had one, I wouldn't have felt safe using it lest I draw his attention. I don't know how he was able to see so well in the dark. I guess his eyes had just adjusted, and I was terrified that he would look up and see me. So I sat there, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for who, or whatever, the hell he was stalking. I scanned around but couldn't see anyone else, even from my vantage point, and the sickening thought struck me that he might be looking for me. I remembered the rustling noises I'd heard in the woods when I first arrived. And then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car that had followed too close behind me for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I'd been annoyed and a little freaked out at the time, but when I'd turned into the nature preserve parking area, the white car passed me and had driven on its way. I hadn't thought anything more of it. Now I wondered, horrified, if this was the driver of that car. If he'd circled back, seen my parked car alone in the lot, if he'd come in after me. I sat, paralyzed with fear, and watched the man for what felt like forever, but was probably a half hour or so. There's a heart-stopping moment when he paused right underneath my tree, and I was sure he was going to look up and find me, but he didn't. After a while, he seemed to give up on whatever plan he had in mind. I heard him say, "Fuck it," and start heading back in the direction he'd come, the direction of the parking area, and I stayed in the tree, wet with sweat and crying until the sun came up a few hours later. Then I climbed down, and still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on a keychain, I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. The man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock. Someone had scraped all down the sides of my car with something sharp. Presumably a giant knife that I'm lucky didn't end up in my chest. Thank God for night vision goggles that let me see him before he could see me, and thank God for big trees with sturdy branches. Creepy forest man. Let's never meet again. Tape recorder. My friend suggested I share my story here, and I finally have the time to type it out. I don't know if this exactly meets the standards of this outlet, but it is definitely the scariest experience I've ever had. Here goes. At the time, I was 10 years old, and I lived in a small coastal town in Newfoundland that was littered with large forests. Almost every house had acres and acres of forestry behind it, which in itself was very beautiful. As now I'm 21 and I live in a bustling city in Alberta, I do find myself missing this setting in my old backyard every once in a while. But it's usually accompanied by the unsettling memory of what I'm about to recount. By the time I was in grade 4, I was already trusted to be home by myself, as my mother was out to visit my grandmother and aunt, who literally lived a few minutes down the road from us. I was happy to have such a privilege. I was an only child, and my father worked in another province months at a time. So I was very lucky to have this opportunity. It usually meant late night movies and video gaming, and on the odd night, exploring the forests. This night I was exploring said woods. I usually never went too far in. Usually up to a large rock formation I like to climb and look through the trees in all directions. The house was always in sight, so I never felt scared or frightened by being there. It felt like my own private place that I could enjoy. So as I was scaling the rocks to sit in my usual spot, I suddenly started hearing a sound from further in. A sound that wasn't natural at all. Crying. Faint crying. It sounded like a child, maybe even an infant, crying relentlessly. I was more puzzled than scared, since the crying was the last thing that I would expect to hear in the forest. I must have listened for a good few minutes, convinced my ears were playing tricks on me, but it was in fact crying. In my mind, I imagined it was a young girl that somehow wandered too far into the forest and needed help. I considered going back to the house and calling my mother to help, but then I worried that the girl would wander further in beyond earshot. I decided to try to locate the sound myself. I made my way hastily through the trees and branches, trying to figure out the exact direction that the crying was in. It definitely wasn't as easy as I thought, and it was a matter of trial and error to even make sure I was going in the right direction. One thing I never realized as I was doing all of this was how consistent this crying was. No pauses, no words of any kind. Just nonstop sobbing and wailing that had no end. What I did notice was the closer I got to the sound, the more metallic it sounded to me. I eventually reached a small clearing that only had a few small trees and bushes and nothing else. I had never gone this far in before, so this was the first time that I had ever seen it. When I made my way in, it didn't take long for me to find the source of the sound. A gray tape recorder, one of the biggest I had ever seen, peeking out of one of the bushes, and the crying was coming out of the speakers. This really disturbed me, as I had gone all the way in expecting to find a real person, but it was only a tape recorder. As I was about to shut it off, I heard another sound coming from just outside the clearing on the opposite side. It sounded like steady steps, advancing in my direction. It only took seeing a tall, shadowy figure coming my way to send me running. Fortunately, by some miracle, I recognized my way back by identifying rocks and trees I identified as landmarks. Looking back, this probably saved my life. I never looked back, and I didn't try listening to see if the person was following me. I just kept telling myself to make it home, and nothing else. I had to get home. Once I saw the large rock formation, it didn't take me long to know the rest of the way without needing to survey my surroundings. I was out of the forest in record time and immediately ran to my house, locking the door and shutting all of the lights off as I went to my bedroom. I didn't want this person to know where I lived, or I would really be done for. After shutting the curtains of my window, I peeked out through them as discreetly as I could to see if whoever had been out there had actually managed to keep up with me. I didn't see anyone, but I stayed by that window for a good hour, waiting for something to emerge out of the forest shadows, but nothing ever did. After that, I went straight to bed. I never did tell my mother about what happened that night, and I was also never able to go back into that forest again. A bed for the night. When I was about 12, my great-uncle John came from Ukraine to visit us in Canada. He had a lot of stories, but this was the one that stood out. In the late 1960s, John was traveling by train from his village to another to visit his family. He had to change trains at one point and was dropped off at what amounted to a platform and a hut in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else at the station, and other than a dirt road that led off into the surrounding woods, there was nothing there. He waited for some time, but no train came. It was winter, and it was getting colder and darker, and just about the time he started worrying about a place to stay and some food to eat, an old woman appeared out of the twilight. She asked if he was waiting for such and such train, and when he said he was, she said it wouldn't be long until the following day. She asked if he needed a bed for the night and offered him a meal and a room at her house, which she said was about an hour's walk from the station. Lodging with locals was more or less the standard when traveling in this part of the USSR, and Great-Uncle John wasn't looking forward to a hungry night on a cold platform, so he was glad to accept her offer. He took his suitcase, and they set off together down the dark road into the forest. It was more than an hour away, more like 2. And by the time they arrived at the woman's small 2-story house, John was tired and hungry. They went inside, and the woman lit some oil lamps and warmed some borscht for them. It was the first time John was able to see the woman clearly, and he was a bit startled to realize that the old woman was actually a man. Not wanting to pry, and too tired to care, John finished his soup and asked where he would be sleeping. She led him up the stairs to a tiny room with a window that contained a single bed and nothing else. He thanked her, they said goodnight, and she closed the door. Then she locked it, leaving him in the dark. Somewhat creeped out by this, John called out to her, but she didn't answer, and he heard nothing else. Figuring he would deal with it in the morning, and that she had probably done it by mistake, John set his suitcase down, laid on the bed, deciding to make the best of it and get some sleep. Before he could fall asleep, though, he felt the urge to pee, and got out of bed, hoping to find a chamber pot or something he could pee in. He got onto his hands and knees where he began to fill under the bed in the darkness, thinking that's where a pot would be if there was one. Instead, he found a body. "Nope," Great-Uncle John said, and went right to the window to see if he could exit the room that way. It was nailed shut. He knew that if he remained in the room, he was probably a dead man. But if he broke the window and tried to get out that way, there was a good chance that the old woman, and who knows who else was there, would hear him and come into the room before he could get away. So he did the only thing he could think to do. He pulled the body out from under the bed, heaved it onto the mattress, and covered it with a blanket. Then he got under the bed and waited. Sure enough, about an hour later, he heard footsteps coming slowly up the stairs and then toward the room. The lock clicked, and the knob turned slowly. In the gloom, John saw someone move towards the bed. Then he heard several terrific and sickening thuds. The person had bashed the body on the head with a large crowbar, which they then dropped onto the floor right in front of John. There was silence. Then the person went out of the room, and the door was shut again. The footsteps went down the stairs, and then there was silence. John moved out from under the bed, took the crowbar, and was able to slowly pry the window open. He didn't say, but I imagine he was shitting bricks the entire time. When the window was up, he threw his suitcase out, then dove through himself, not caring what was below him, only worried about what was behind. He landed without too much injury and began to run into a field behind the house towards some lights in the far distance. It turned out to be a highway with some military and transfer trucks on it. John was able to get a ride to another village where he could catch a train. He didn't bother reporting what had happened to the authorities, since at that time in the USSR, there was a distinct chance he would have been the one who got in trouble. He just thanked God and escaped, and decided that the next time he traveled to visit relatives, he would take another way. Old Men in the Woods. Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienteering expedition, basically a long trek through woodland and rural villages, following nothing but a map and a compass. No GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience, and you camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. Anyway, I was out of shape at the time, and so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight like I thought we would have time to during the real thing, but we hiked maybe 10 miles through the woods and a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back up to the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees either side. We were marching onward in silence, and at this point all of a sudden there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit, a red bow tie, and dress shoes. He looked late 70s, early 80s, very pale, liver spots dotting his face, and a gray-white comb-over. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought, seeing a guy his age out here in those clothes in these weather conditions, was, this guy's lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice that puzzled me. The guy was bone dry. He didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked at seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, and then suddenly became very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He started flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk and then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After maybe a minute or so, he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him, so we continued to follow the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down the slope that was probably a 40-degree angle, spanned for 50 feet or more, and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there were no shrubs or roots to hold on to or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering, how did he cross that so quickly? I mean, at that distance, it's hard to see fine detail clearly, but I swear he did not have any mud or water on him at all. My uncle and I looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step towards the edge, and I was going to try and make my way down when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. Under his breath, he said, "Something's wrong here." We took a few steps back from the edge, and at this point the old man at the bottom started getting irate. He began pleading with us again to come down the slope, that he needed our help, that his friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down to the old man that we would head back to the car and call emergency services for him, that professional help would be on its way soon. They would have all the tools to help him, etc. The old man suddenly got furious. He began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right now or there would be hell to pay. His voice had changed drastically. He was practically growling these words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his fists on his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out of their sockets, his skin gone from pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter mile or so to the car, all the while my uncle was on the phone to emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possible mentally ill old man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get to our car and wait the police, so we could show them where we had encountered him. About an hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them and packs of supplies, like first aid, emergency blankets, etc. We led them to that exact spot, and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction through the bushes that he led us. The search lasted all weekend, but there was no trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we encountered. One of my weirdest experiences to date. Stalkers in the Canyon. About 4 years ago, I was a junior at a small college in LA. Bordering my town was a large cavernous region known as Turnbull Canyon. It's the kind of place that has a healthy amount of creepy folklore surrounding it, with an area emphatically known as Hell's Gates. Stories of cold activity, gang killings, abandoned mental institutions, and the like. It's the kind of thing you hear about any old place old enough to have a reputation. In reality, most of the stories were spurned from a tragedy that occurred years prior. A woman's body was found at the base of the canyon, and from then on the rest is history. Nevertheless, when a photographer friend asked me and another buddy to go out to the canyon in order to take some photos of the LA skyline, I had to oblige. The canyon was about a 30-minute drive from our campus, and we had been listening to the King of Limbs the entire drive, which proved to be the perfect ambiance to get me feeling pretty anxious about our little excursion. I should also note that I'm a pretty anxious guy in general, so traveling out to a remote area preceded by its reputation for scary occurrences admittedly had me thinking twice about that decision. At the top of the canyon, there's a small residential area, a few ritzy houses surrounded by trees and woods. In order to venture into the canyon itself, you have to follow a main trail with several smaller arteries that split off in other directions, but ultimately culminate after a couple miles or so at the base of a steep hill adorned with an old water tower overlooking the city. Anyhow, we parked our car at the top of the canyon road, divvied up the camera gear, and made our way out to the trailhead, around 1 a.m. at this point. After walking the trail for about 5 minutes, Dave, the photographer, decided it was time to set up first shot while Jeff, our other friend, and I kept watch. Eventually he got the shot he needed, and we continued walking for another 5 or so minutes before Dave decided to set up his next shot. At this point, the trailhead had disappeared behind us completely, and we were a little less than a quarter of the way to the water tower. While setting up the tripod, we noticed the faint glow of headlights off in the distance, which was strange because the trail isn't meant for cars, nor is it big enough for them to pass through. If I recall, it's only about 5 feet wide, with shrubbery on both sides. This was clearly a bit of a red flag for us as we were the only people out there, so we immediately packed up our things and ducked off into the brush, waiting for the car to pass on. Eventually, an old pickup truck idled to a stop about 50 yards from where we were hiding. The truck itself was old and rickety, sitting on a lifted chassis, the bed of which was missing entirely. Growing up in the country, I knew it as the type of truck typically owned by backwoods folk who lived in the boonies and preferred to be left to their own devices. We watched in agonizing anticipation as the truck just idled in place for several minutes before flooring it down one of the other trails, the roar of the engine echoing throughout the canyon. Clearly we were spooked at this point, the three of us speculating as to our next step. Jeff and I were reluctant to continue, and Dave assured us that it was probably nothing, perhaps just a guy off-roading, as he put it. So with great reluctance, Jeff and I trudged on behind Dave towards the water tower to get his final shots. Nevertheless, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about that truck. I mean, I knew plenty of people in high school who would go off-roading for fun in the woods, but never on finicky canyon trails barely wide enough to hike on, let alone drive. It just didn't sit right with me. After walking without interference for about an hour, we finally made it out to the water tower. We climbed the hill to the top and took in the view of the city. Dave, once again, started setting up his equipment while Jeff and I stood on both sides of the water tower, keeping watch just in case the truck came back. Nothing. At this point, it's around 3 a.m. Dave decides he's got all the shots he needs, so we pack up our equipment and commit to heading back before it gets too late, seeing how all of us had classes in just a few hours. Just as we're preparing to descend the hill, the truck comes roaring out of the canyon below us, back onto the trail, at which point the driver attempts to climb the hill, revving the engine loudly. Scared witless, the three of us slid off the side of the hill into the brush, clinging onto plants and rocks. As the truck finally made it to the top of the hill, slowly driving around the tower, we could see the glow of the headlights each time it circled above us. After waiting nearly 10 minutes, while also trying not to make any noise, of course, the truck eventually descended the hill, stopping in the middle of the trail, no more than 100 yards away. We watched as a scruffy man, mid-50s, stepped out of the idling truck and into the glow of his headlights, moseying around and looking at the ground. He knelt down, looking at something in the dirt, surveying the area intently. As he did so, it became increasingly apparent that he was tracking something. Our footprints. The next part still chills me to the bone. As my friends and I huddled together watching in complete terror, another man wearing a long, dark parka emerged from the brush, right where we had been walking, joining the other man at his side. Apparently he had been out there the entire time we were walking the trail, just watching us, following behind at a safe distance. The two of them talked for a while, but we couldn't hear a word. They continued scanning the area, looking at our footprints, but eventually got back in the truck and drove off down the road. We sat in silence for a long time, waiting nearly 2 hours just to ensure the coast was clear, at which point we made it like hell back to the car, down the canyon, and back to campus, just in time for class. Shooting gallery. I was almost killed in the mountains. I used to work at a security company with a bunch of friends. We all got along well, and most of us even hung out after work. The ones I didn't hang out with kept to themselves. There were 2 brothers that worked night shifts with me, and they were in their own group. They were new to the company and would have many conversations about their guns. Bill was the older brother, and Luke was the younger brother. After hearing Luke and Bill talk about target shooting so much, I developed an interest. I don't own a single firearm, but my roommate owns several. I mentioned at work one night that I was going shooting in the morning with my roommate, and I needed a good place to go. Well, the 2 brothers pointed out a spot on Google Earth for me and said it was great, and they have shot up there before. It was about 45 minutes away, and higher up in the mountains. I knew the spot precisely due to a single image posted to the coordinates on Google Earth, with used shotgun shells covering the ground. I decided that was as good a spot as any and told my roommate Dawn where to drive us. We arrived the next morning at 10 a.m. and parked at the top of the hill. We saw our spot about 150 yards away in a clearing down in the valley and began hiking down. On a quick side note, I wear this very bright neon yellow hooded sweatshirt at work and during the winter. I'm also a pretty large fella. Being big and brightly colored makes you very visible from very far away. I've seen hunters using bright colors to avoid accidentally getting shot by other hunters.
I decided to wear my trademark bright hoodie on our little hike. We made it a quarter way down the hill and I see a group of fellow target shooters at our desired spot. These were the only people we had seen in 30 minutes. Our spot's taken. Lame, I said. The second I said lame, that's where shit hits the fan. We're on the side of a mountain, walking down towards them, and the rounds start flying. The group was shooting at us. Don and I were targets for about 3 guns, and we didn't have immediate cover. I see Don running across the mountain, strafing the shooters. I see what he was running for. It was a small plateau about 20 yards next to us. The sounds of bullets flying inches away from my ears is a sound I will never forget. Movies do not do the sound justice at all. Not even close. I still get chills thinking about it now. The vibration and rotation of the bullets chilled my bones. It's not a sound I ever want to hear again. It made everything go slow-mo and very clear. My adrenaline was kicking in. We made it to cover and hit the dirt. We were pinned down, but we had cover now. I had to have heard at least 100 rounds pass just over the tip of the plateau. I heard a pistol, a rifle, and a shotgun. I know I did. The trees, boulders, and mountainside were being hammered by round after round. If we sat up from our cover, we'd have been shot in the face. These people were shooting up a hill towards a road. They had their backs to the paper targets. Thinking back on it, my father said I should have yelled down to them to let them know that they were shooting at 2 people and to hold their fire. But the thing is, I think they knew they were shooting at us. How could they not? We weren't that far and the mountainside was almost bare. I didn't want to let them know they were close to hitting us. I should have shot back. We had the high ground, but I'm not a killer. We just waited and listened for their footsteps and wanted them to stay where they were. If we were killed, no one would find our bodies out there. 15 minutes went by and the gunfire didn't let up until it just ended. The mountain was quiet again. After 5 more minutes of silence, we checked down the hill. They were gone. We had our guns ready as we scanned the valley down below. Nothing. No more guys, no vehicle, just their garbage left behind. We decided this was a great time to get out of the hills. We made it back to our car and back to our house faster than ever. When I went back to work the next shift, I told that story to everyone. I even thanked Bill for the sweet advice. He apologized for the bad locals and said that was crazy. Another coworker told me Bill and Luke went out shooting the same morning I did, in the same area. I asked Bill about it, and I asked him where he went shooting and what guns he brought to the shoot. He pointed at the same Google Earth image as before. Luke, his friend Bill were using a Glock and a .22 rifle and a 12-gauge shotgun. It was all coming together so quickly. I told him he was a psycho and he almost killed us. He denied shooting at us and even changed his mind about where they were shooting. He said he was actually 2 miles west because his GPS was inaccurate. I knew he was lying, but what could I do? I had no proof. He worked with me for another 2 years before I moved away and never heard from him again. I remember how emotionless he was when he denied shooting at me. He was like a robot. We never spoke of it after the first time, and I haven't gone shooting since. The dog on the road. This particular event happened almost a year ago, sometime in mid-October. A couple friends and I drove out to visit old friends of ours from high school, George, who now lived about an hour out of the city. We spent the whole day with him, and it was really late when we finally decided to start the drive back home. My friend Lisa was passed out in the passenger seat. She'd had a few drinks and decided to spend the ride home asleep. My other friend Sam was sitting in the back seat behind Lisa and was playing a game on her smartphone. I, of course, was driving. I was following the GPS's instructions back to the freeway. At that moment, we were driving down a dark street with thick trees bordering both sides. Everything was pretty peaceful, with the only sounds I could hear being that of the car moving along the road and the radio on low volume. Suddenly, my car let out a loud jolt and felt as if I had hit something. Sam let out a shocked scream while Lisa remained dead asleep. I slammed on the brakes, and the car came to a halt. I was breathing heavily when I asked what the hell had just happened. Sam peered through the back window and gasped. She turned to me with an angry look on her face and shouted that I had just hit a dog. I looked through the back window, and sure enough, a dog was lying in the road a few yards behind the car. Sam is a pretty big animal lover, so I wasn't surprised to see her get pissed at me. She was about to open her door and rush to the animal's aid when I stopped her. Once I had gotten over the shock of running over the dog, I got a feeling in my gut that told me something was off. I'm no braggart, but I consider myself to be very attentive and a safe driver. My eyes were on the road at all times, and I distinctly remember not seeing a dog in the road prior to the car jolting. Yeah, it was dark, but I was sure I would have at least seen the dog in the headlights before hitting it. I looked through the back window and took a closer look at the dog, or at least as much as I could make out in the reddish light coming from my taillights. It was a fairly big dog, at least a golden retriever or something like that. One particular detail caught my attention. I could see the tail's dog wagging. Now, I'm no expert on the mannerisms of animals, but I'm sure the last thing a dog would do after being hit by a car would be to wag its tail. After a moment of thought, I pressed my foot down on the accelerator and sped off. Sam snapped at me and ordered me to go back, but I told her something was wrong with the whole situation. She continued to argue, but she fell silent as she turned back towards the back window. She asked, "What the heck?" with a shaken voice. I looked in the rearview mirror. Though it was dark, I was able to make out the silhouettes of 3 large figures emerging from the trees on the side of the road. The dog was now up on its feet and jumping around joyfully. The 3 figures looked in our direction as I pressed my foot down on the gas harder and sped off. Sam and I remained silent for the rest of the ride home. It wasn't until a few days later we told Lisa about it. We've been back to visit George a few times since then, but always make sure to leave before sunset. Still dread to think what would have happened if we had gotten out of the car.